In 1940, two archaeologists crawled into a small, dry cave near Fallon, Nevada, and found a man lying in a shallow pit, wrapped in a woven mat of bulrush. His skin was still intact. His moccasins were still on his feet. He looked like he might have died a few decades earlier. He had been dead for nearly 11,000 years. That man, the spirit cave mummy, would spend the next half-century at the center of one of the most bitter scientific and legal battles over human remains in American history. And when the fight was finally settled, it wasn't archaeologists or lawyers who delivered the answer. It was his own DNA. Today, we're crossing the Nevada desert to visit 7 places where the sand, the rock, and the dry air preserve things that force us to rethink what we thought we knew. About the first Americans, about prehistoric engineering, about what hunter-gatherers were actually capable of, and about what happens when something from outer space slams into a shallow sea at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour. Let's start with the man in the cave. The year was 1940. Sydney and Georgia Wheeler, a husband and wife team working for the Nevada State Parks, were conducting a survey of caves and rock shelters in the Lahontan Basin of western Nevada. The area around Fallon is dry, dusty, and unremarkable on the surface. Flat alkali flats, low scrubby hills, the kind of landscape most people drive through without stopping. But the caves and the surrounding ridges had been used by people for thousands of years, and the Wheelers knew it. Spirit Cave was a small opening in a rocky hillside, not particularly impressive. Inside, they found several burials. One of them was different. The remains were partially mummified, not through any deliberate embalming process, but through the natural desiccation of the cave environment. The extremely dry air had preserved soft tissue, hair, and even the woven textile wrapping that had been placed around the body. The man had been laid in a shallow pit and covered with a finely woven mat made from bulrush fibers. On his feet were moccasins. Nearby were other artifacts consistent with a burial. The Wheelers cataloged the find, and the remains were eventually sent to the Nevada State Museum in Carson City. For decades, the Spirit Cave mummy sat in storage. Researchers assumed the burial was a few thousand years old at most, consistent with other Great Basin finds. Nobody suspected what radiocarbon dating would eventually reveal. In 1994, researchers submitted samples from the burial wrappings and the remains for accelerator mass spectrometry radiocarbon dating. The results were stunning. The Spirit Cave individual dated to approximately 10,600 years before present, later refined to roughly 10,700 years ago. That made him one of the oldest known mummified human remains in North America. The woven mat wrapped around his body was, at the time, the oldest known example of sophisticated textile weaving anywhere on the continent. Think about that for a moment. More than 10,000 years ago, someone in what is now Nevada was weaving textiles complex enough that modern analysts classified the technique as comparable to fine fabric. This was not a crude grass bundle. It was a carefully constructed artifact that demonstrated real skill and tradition. But the age of the remains was only the beginning of the controversy. Physical anthropologists who examined the skull noted that certain cranial measurements did not closely match those of modern Native American populations. The facial structure appeared narrower, and some researchers argued that the Spirit Cave man resembled populations associated with East Asia or even the Ainu of Japan more closely than he resembled the indigenous peoples living in the Great Basin in recent centuries. This observation fed directly into a much larger and far more contentious debate. During the 1990s, several ancient human remains discovered in North America, most famously Kennewick Man in Washington state, were described by some scientists as having physical features that differed from those of modern Native American populations. A controversial hypothesis emerged suggesting that the earliest inhabitants of North America might have been biologically distinct Paleo-Americans, who were later displaced or absorbed by the ancestors of today's indigenous peoples. The implications were enormous, and they were not purely academic. Under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, indigenous tribes had the legal right to claim and rebury ancestral remains. But if the earliest Americans were not biologically connected to modern tribes, some argued, then NAGPRA should not apply. The legal and cultural stakes could not have been higher. At the heart of the dispute was a question that sounds simple, but proved extraordinarily difficult to answer. Whose ancestor was this man? the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe requested repatriation of the Spirit Cave remains, asserting cultural affiliation. The Bureau of Land Management initially denied the claim, citing the ambiguous cranial measurements and the extreme antiquity of the remains. The case went to court. It dragged on for years. And then, genetics changed everything. In 2018, a landmark study published in the journal Science analyzed the genome of the Spirit Cave individual. The results were unambiguous. The Spirit Cave man was genetically most closely related to contemporary Native American populations, specifically to groups in Central and South America, consistent with the broader pattern of a single major migration wave into the Americas. He was not a member of some separate, vanished population. He was ancestral to the same indigenous lineages that have inhabited the Americas for millennia. The Paleo-American hypothesis, the idea that the earliest Americans were fundamentally different people, unrelated to modern Native Americans, collapsed under the weight of the genetic evidence. The cranial measurements that had generated so much controversy turned out to reflect normal variation within a population, rather than evidence of a separate origin. Skull shape, it turned out, was a poor proxy for ancestry. DNA told a clearer story. Following the genetic findings, the Spirit Cave remains were repatriated to the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe in 2016, and the individual was reburied. The case became one of the most significant examples of how ancient DNA research can resolve, or at least fundamentally redirect, debates that physical anthropology alone could not settle. The real significance of the Spirit Cave mummy is not that a preserved body was found in a Nevada cave. It is that a man who died more than 10,000 years ago became the fulcrum of a modern argument about identity, ancestry, science, and law, and that his own genome, extracted from ancient bone, ultimately spoke more clearly than any measurement or legal brief. Now, about 100 kilometers to the north of Spirit Cave, on the edge of a lake that no longer exists, someone carved something into the rock that might be even older. Winnemucca Lake sits in the western Nevada desert, roughly 55 kilometers northeast of Reno, or rather, it used to sit there. Today, the lake bed is mostly dry, a flat, pale expanse of cracked sediment surrounded by low, rocky ridges. It is not the kind of place that draws crowds. But on a set of large limestone boulders near the western edge of the former lake, researchers documented something that stopped them cold. Carved deeply into the rock surfaces are enormous geometric designs. These are not the small, shallow scratches typical of much later Great Basin rock art. The Winnemucca Lake petroglyphs include complex patterns, deeply incised lines forming diamond shapes, nested curves, branching tree-like forms, circular pits, and abstract motifs that have no obvious representational meaning. Some of the individual carvings are large, covering substantial portions of the boulder faces, and the depth of the incisions is striking. Whoever made these carvings spent serious time and effort grinding designs into hard limestone. The obvious question is, how old are they? And here is where the story gets both fascinating and frustrating. You cannot directly radiocarbon date a petroglyph. Radiocarbon dating works on organic material, charcoal, bone, wood, plant fibers. A groove carved into stone contains no organic carbon that could be dated to the moment of carving, so researchers had to find another way. The method they used was geological. Winnemucca Lake, like many lakes in the Great Basin, has a long history of rising and falling water levels driven by changes in climate over thousands of years. During wetter periods, the lake rose and submerged the boulders. During drier periods, the water dropped and exposed them. Each time the lake covered the rocks, carbonate minerals, essentially a thin crust of calcium carbonate, were deposited on the surfaces, including on any carvings that had already been made. By radiocarbon dating the carbonate coatings on and around the petroglyphs, and by reconstructing the known history of lake-level changes in the region, researchers established a window. The carvings had to have been made during a period when the boulders were above the waterline, that is, when the lake was low enough to expose the rock surfaces. Based on the available evidence, the research team led by Larry Trask and published through the University of Colorado in 2013 concluded that the petroglyphs were created sometime between approximately 10,500 and 14,800 years ago. That range is important, and it deserves careful treatment. The younger end of the range, around 10,500 years ago, would already make the Winnemucca Lake petroglyphs very old, roughly contemporary with the Spirit Cave mummy. The older end of the range, 14,800 years ago, would place them among the absolute oldest known examples of rock art anywhere in North America, predating most confirmed human sites on the continent. But there is a significant difference between saying these carvings could be up to 14,800 years old and saying these carvings are definitively 14,800 years old. The age estimate depends on the reconstruction of ancient lake levels, which involves its own uncertainties. The carbonate dating provides a geological constraint, not a direct measurement of the moment someone picked up a stone tool and started carving. It is a bracket, not a pinpoint. What we can say is that these are among the most compelling candidates for the oldest rock art in North America, and the carvings themselves are genuinely strange. They do not depict recognizable animals, human figures, or hunting scenes. They are deeply abstract, geometric patterns that resist easy interpretation. Were they territorial markers? Ritual symbols? A system of communication? Maps? Something entirely outside modern categories? Nobody knows. And nobody knows who carved them. The people who created these designs lived in a landscape that looked nothing like the dry basin we see today. When the carvings were made, Winnemucca Lake held water. The surrounding terrain supported different vegetation, different animal populations, and a very different way of life. The carvers belonged to a world that vanished with the lake. What does it feel like to stand in front of a design carved into stone perhaps 15,000 years ago and realize that you have absolutely no framework for understanding what the person who made it was trying to say? That is what the Winnemucca Lake petroglyphs offer. Not an answer, but a confrontation with the sheer depth of human presence in this landscape, and with how much of that presence we have permanently lost. Here is a question worth thinking about. If the oldest confirmed petroglyphs in North America turn out to be deeply abstract geometric patterns rather than realistic animal drawings, what does that suggest about the minds of the people who made them? Were the earliest artistic traditions in the Americas already operating at a symbolic, conceptual level rather than a representational one? Write your answer in the comments, because this is one of those questions that genuinely does not have a settled answer. Now let's move to a different kind of discovery. Not art on rock, but objects hidden underground. Deliberately, carefully, and for reasons that took archaeologists years to figure out. Hidden Cave is located in the Grimes Point area of western Nevada, near the town of Fallon, the same general region as Spirit Cave. The cave itself is not easy to spot. Its entrance is narrow, inconvenient, and partially concealed by the surrounding rock formations. It is not the kind of place you would choose to live if you had other options. And that, it turns out, was exactly the point. When archaeologists excavated Hidden Cave in the early 1950s, and then again more systematically in 1979 and 1980, under the direction of David Hurst Thomas of the American Museum of Natural History, they found something that did not match the expected pattern of a residential site. In a typical habitation cave, archaeologists expect to find a mixture of materials: broken tools, discarded food remains, fire-cracked rock from cooking hearths, fragments of baskets or cordage, stone debitage from tool-making, the general debris of daily life. The material is usually scattered, mixed, and accumulated gradually over time as people lived, ate, worked, and discarded things in the course of ordinary activities. Hidden Cave was different. Many of the artifacts were intact, not broken, not worn out, not discarded. Stone tools, projectile points, handstones, and other equipment appeared to have been placed in the cave while they were still perfectly functional. Some objects seem to have been deliberately grouped together in specific areas, as if they had been bundled or stored in particular spots rather than casually tossed aside. Food remains were also present, but again, the pattern was unusual. Instead of the scattered refuse of meals eaten on site, researchers found cached food, stored provisions that appeared to have been placed in the cave for future retrieval. Bulrush seeds, small mammal remains, and other food items seemed to have been stockpiled. Taken together, the evidence pointed to a conclusion that was surprising at the time, but now makes elegant sense. Hidden Cave was not primarily a place to live, it was a place to hide things. Roughly 3,500 to 3,800 years ago, and possibly during other periods as well, people in the region were using Hidden Cave as a concealed storage facility. They brought tools, food, and other supplies to the cave, deposited them in organized caches, and then left. When they needed those supplies again, perhaps weeks, months, or even a season later, they returned. Think about what that implies for the way these people organize their lives. The Great Basin is a vast, harsh landscape of widely scattered resources. Water, food plants, game animals, and raw materials for tools are not evenly distributed. People living in this environment moved constantly, following seasonal patterns, harvesting piñon nuts in the mountains in autumn, collecting seeds in the lowlands in summer, hunting in different zones at different times of year. If you are moving through a territory covering hundreds of square kilometers, carrying everything you own becomes a problem. You cannot haul every tool, every stored food supply, and every piece of equipment with you across the desert every time you relocate. But if you can stash supplies at strategic points along your seasonal route, you create something like a logistics network, a prehistoric system of hidden supply depots scattered across the landscape. That is exactly what Hidden Cave appears to represent, and it almost certainly was not the only one. If people were caching supplies in Hidden Cave, they were likely doing the same thing at other concealed locations throughout the region. The desert, in other words, was not an empty void that people merely trudged across. It was a managed landscape full of hidden resources, planned routes, and pre-positioned supplies. What archaeologists still debate is who, exactly, was using Hidden Cave, and how frequently. Were the caches maintained by a single family group, returning to the same circuit year after year? Were multiple groups using the cave independently? Did the pattern of storage persist continuously for centuries, or was the cave used intensively for a while and then abandoned? The stratigraphy provides some answers. Different layers correspond to different periods of deposition, but the full picture remains incomplete. There is also a deeper question that Hidden Cave raises about how we think about hunter-gatherer societies in general. For a long time, popular imagination, and sometimes academic writing too, treated mobile hunter-gatherers as people who lived hand-to-mouth, reacting passively to whatever the environment offered. Hidden Cave tells a different story. These were people planning ahead, anticipating future needs, investing effort in strategic locations, and building an invisible infrastructure across the landscape that required memory, coordination, and long-term thinking. The cave, in a sense, is a storage unit, a 10,000-year-old self-storage unit buried in the Nevada desert, rented by people whose names we will never know. If you find this kind of story fascinating, the kind where the real mystery is not aliens or lost continents, but the sheer ingenuity of people we have consistently underestimated, subscribe to the channel, because the more we dig into the archaeology of the American West, the more the old stereotypes start to fall apart. Speaking of underestimating people, let's talk about what happens when you need to kill several hundred pronghorn at once. Pronghorn, Antilocapra americana, are the fastest land animals in the Western Hemisphere. They can sustain speeds above 85 kilometers per hour over long distances. They have extraordinary eyesight. They are, by any measure, spectacularly difficult to hunt. A single person with a spear or an atlatl trying to chase down a pronghorn on foot has essentially zero chance of success. But pronghorn have a behavioral vulnerability. They are reluctant to jump over obstacles. When confronted with a low barrier, even one that they could easily leap, they tend to run parallel to it rather than over it. If you know this, and if you have enough people to coordinate a large-scale operation, you can exploit that behavior in a devastating way. At Whiskey Flat, in the Nevada desert, archaeologists documented the remains of an enormous communal pronghorn trap. The system consisted of long guide fences, low stone or brush alignments stretching across the landscape, designed to funnel moving animals gradually toward a confined enclosure or kill zone. One of the guidelines at Whiskey Flat extended approximately 2.3 kilometers. That is not a typo. 2.3 kilometers, roughly the length of 23 football fields laid end to end. What remains today is subtle. You will not see dramatic stone walls or towering ruins. The guide fences were low, probably never more than waist high, and in many places much lower. They were built from loosely stacked stones, brush, and possibly wooden stakes. Over centuries of exposure to wind, weather, and natural decay, the structures have collapsed into faint alignments that are barely visible on the ground. Archaeologists recognize them through careful surface survey, aerial photography, and the distinctive linear patterns of displaced rocks that do not match natural geological features. The way such systems probably worked is well understood from ethnographic accounts, oral traditions, and archaeological parallels across the Great Basin and the wider American West. A communal pronghorn hunt was a major social event, one that required planning, coordination, and a significant investment of labor. Before the hunt, the guide fences had to be constructed or repaired. That alone represented an enormous amount of work. Moving and stacking enough stone and brush to create a barrier stretching for more than 2 kilometers across open desert required many hands. Then, during the hunt itself, groups of people would spread out across the landscape, positioning themselves to drive pronghorn herds toward the mouth of the funnel. The animals, encountering the low barriers, would follow them rather than jump over, gradually funneling into the increasingly narrow corridor until they reached the trap at the end, a corral, a natural cul-de-sac, or a confined space where hunters could dispatch them efficiently. A single successful drive could yield dozens or even hundreds of animals. The meat, hides, sinew, and bone produced by such an event would sustain a community for weeks or months. The surplus could be dried, stored, and traded. Now consider what this tells us about the people who built and operated this system. These were not isolated family bands scratching out a marginal existence in the desert. To build a hunting system covering more than 2 kilometers, you need a large labor force. To coordinate a drive involving dozens or possibly hundreds of beaters, drivers, and hunters spread across kilometers of terrain, you need communication, leadership, and planning. To return to the same location season after season, maintaining and repairing the infrastructure, you need institutional knowledge and social continuity. For decades, the Great Basin hunter-gatherers were treated in much of the anthropological literature as among the simplest, most rudimentary societies on Earth. Small, loosely organized groups with minimal social complexity. That image owes more to the biases of early observers than to the actual archaeological record. Sites like Whiskey Flat make it clear that Great Basin peoples were capable of organizing labor on a scale comparable to many agricultural societies, and that they did so in one of the most challenging environments on the continent. The pronghorn trap also raises a question that is harder to answer than it sounds. How old is it? Dating open-air stone alignments in the desert is notoriously difficult. The stones themselves cannot be radiocarbon dated. Organic material associated with the features is scarce. Some researchers have attempted to use lichenometry, measuring the growth of lichens on stone surfaces, or to correlate the alignments with dated occupation layers in nearby sites, but precise dates remain elusive. What is clear is that communal pronghorn hunting in the Great Basin has deep roots, extending back thousands of years, and that the Whiskey Flat system represents one of the most impressive physical examples of this tradition. The next time someone tells you that the desert was empty before Europeans arrived, ask them who built a 2-kilometer-long hunting machine across the Nevada flats, and then organized a small army to operate it. Now we travel south, to a part of Nevada that most people associate with something very different: Las Vegas, the Hoover Dam, and Lake Mead. But long before any of that existed, the Moapa Valley held something that would stun the first archaeologists who saw it. In the early 20th century, researchers began documenting an extensive complex of ancient settlements in the Moapa Valley, in the southern tip of Nevada, near what is now the town of Overton. What they found was not a single isolated ruin. It was a network of sites stretching across the valley, multi-room adobe and stone buildings, some of which were large enough to rival Puebloan settlements elsewhere in the American Southwest. The complex was initially called Pueblo Grande de Nevada. Later it became known, somewhat misleadingly, as Nevada's Lost City. The name is misleading because the site was never truly lost. Local Paiute people had always known the ruins were there, and early settlers had noted them as well. But for the wider scientific community, the scale of the discovery was a genuine surprise. Nevada was supposed to be a place of small, mobile bands, not large, permanent settlements with multi-room architecture. The settlements were built and occupied by ancestral Puebloan peoples, the same broad cultural tradition that produced the famous cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde and the great houses of Chaco Canyon. The Moapa Valley occupation dates primarily to the Pueblo II period, roughly from about 900 to 1150 CE, although human presence in the valley extends much further back. The builders constructed rectangular, multi-room structures from adobe, stone, and timber. Some of the structures contained many rooms. One building reportedly had more than 100 rooms, making it one of the largest known Puebloan structures in the southern Nevada region. The settlements were not random. The Moapa Valley offered critical resources. The Muddy River provided a reliable water source in an otherwise arid landscape. The surrounding terrain contains salt deposits, a commodity of enormous value in the ancient world, both for food preservation and for trade. Archaeological evidence suggests that salt exploitation was a significant economic activity, and the Moapa Valley settlements may have functioned partly as nodes in a broader regional exchange network connecting southern Nevada with areas to the south and east. Inside the buildings, archaeologists recovered a rich assemblage of artifacts: pottery, including both locally made types and imported wares from other Puebloan regions, turquoise beads, shell ornaments traded from the Pacific coast, stone tools, grinding stones, agricultural implements, and food remains indicating the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash. The picture that emerged was one of a well-established, economically connected agricultural community, not an isolated outpost. But here is where the story takes its strange, distinctly modern turn. In the 1930s, the United States government began construction of the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River, downstream from the Moapa Valley. When completed, the dam would create Lake Mead, one of the largest artificial reservoirs in the Western Hemisphere, and as the lake filled, its rising waters would submerge much of the Moapa Valley, including large portions of the archaeological landscape. A race began. Between 1924 and 1938, Governor Scrugham and later the Civilian Conservation Corps and the National Park Service conducted extensive salvage excavations, trying to document and recover as much material as possible before the water arrived. The work was hurried, the conditions were difficult, and the standards of excavation, by modern lights, were sometimes rough. But the sheer volume of material recovered was impressive. Thousands of artifacts were removed and eventually housed in the Lost City Museum, built near Overton specifically to display and preserve findings from the doomed sites. When Lake Mead filled, large sections of the archaeological complex disappeared beneath the water. Some of the most important sites were inundated. The irony was bitter and obvious. Archaeologists had discovered a major ancient settlement complex in the Nevada desert, only to watch modern engineering place substantial parts of it permanently underwater. In recent decades, prolonged drought in the Colorado River basin has caused Lake Mead's water level to drop dramatically. As the lake recedes, some previously submerged archaeological sites have re-emerged, eroded, damaged, but visible again for the first time in decades. The falling water level has created an unexpected, bittersweet opportunity for researchers to revisit parts of the lost city that their predecessors could only photograph before the flood. The Moapa Valley story is a study in contradictions. An ancient civilization thrived in one of the hottest, driest corners of North America by controlling water and exploiting salt. 1,000 years later, a modern civilization drowned that same landscape by controlling water on an even larger scale. And now, as climate change and overuse drain the modern reservoir, the ancient ruins are resurfacing, like a message from the past that refuses to stay buried. From the flooded ruins of the Moapa Valley, we turn east, toward a cave that saw human beings come and go for nearly 13,000 years, and recorded every visit. Bonneville Estates Rock Shelter sits in the arid hills of eastern Nevada, near the Utah border. It is not a dramatic cavern. It is a rock shelter, an overhanging cliff face that creates a protected space beneath the rock, shielded from rain and wind, but open to the air. These kinds of sites are among the most valuable in archaeology because the sheltered environment preserves organic material: bone, charcoal, plant remains, cordage, textiles that would decay rapidly in open-air settings. What makes Bonneville Estates exceptional is not any single spectacular artifact. It is the depth and continuity of the record. Excavations at the site recovered stratified deposits spanning nearly 13,000 years of human activity, from the earliest Paleo-Indian period through the late prehistoric era. The layers accumulated gradually as sediment, ash, organic debris, and cultural material built up over millennia, each new deposit sealing the one below. And the dating is extraordinary. Researchers obtained 247 radiocarbon dates from the site, a staggering number for any single archaeological location. Most excavations produce a handful of radiocarbon dates, maybe a dozen or two for a well-funded project. 247 dates from a single rock shelter gives archaeologists an almost unprecedented ability to track how human activity at the site changed over time. Not in rough approximations of early, middle, and late, but in fine-grained detail spanning centuries and millennia. What the dates revealed was not a simple story of continuous occupation. People did not arrive at Bonneville Estates 13,000 years ago and then stay forever. Instead, the intensity of human activity rose and fell repeatedly. There were periods when the shelter was used heavily, thick deposits of charcoal, bone, stone tools, and other debris indicating frequent visits or extended stays. And there were periods when activity dropped off sharply, leaving thin, nearly sterile layers that suggest the shelter was rarely visited or abandoned entirely. The critical finding is that several of the sharpest declines in human activity at the site corresponded with documented periods of severe, prolonged drought in the Great Basin. When the climate deteriorated, when springs dried up, lake levels fell, plant productivity crashed, and game animals became scarce, people reduced their use of the shelter. In some cases, the record suggests that human presence in the area essentially vanished for centuries. But, and this is the part that matters, they came back. When conditions improved, when the rains returned and the lakes refilled and the vegetation recovered, people returned to Bonneville Estates. Sometimes the gap was a few generations, sometimes it was centuries, but the pattern repeated itself over and over across nearly 13,000 years. Arrival, use, decline, abandonment, return. This pattern carries a message that is both humbling and reassuring. The Great Basin has never been an easy place to live. Drought is not an anomaly. It is a recurring feature of the regional climate, and it has been driving people away and drawing them back for as long as humans have inhabited the area. The people of the Great Basin did not simply endure climate change passively. They adapted. They moved. They adjusted the scale and intensity of their use of different areas. And when conditions improved, they came back and started again. Bonneville Estates rock shelter is, in a sense, a 13,000-year-long graph of human resilience in the face of environmental stress. It does not tell a story of triumph or of tragedy. It tells a story of persistence, of people who figured out how to survive in a landscape that periodically tried to kill them, and who kept coming back anyway. If you know someone who thinks the desert has no history, share this video with them. Because a single rock shelter in eastern Nevada contains more recorded history than most European cathedrals. Now we leave archaeology behind entirely. We leave behind the mummies, the rock art, the hidden caches, the hunting traps, the drowned cities, and the patient layers of a 13,000-year-old shelter. We travel south into the mountains of southern Nevada, and we go back, far back, to a time when the entire region was covered by a warm, shallow sea, and something fell out of the sky. Approximately 382 million years ago, during the late Devonian period, what is now southern Nevada looked nothing like the desert we see today. There were no mountains, there were no valleys, there was no sand. The region was submerged beneath a shallow tropical ocean, part of an extensive marine platform teeming with life: corals, brachiopods, crinoids, and countless other organisms that thrived in warm, sunlit water. And then something hit. The Alamo impact event is the name geologists have given to a massive extraterrestrial collision, an asteroid or comet striking the shallow sea that covered present-day Nevada during the Devonian. The evidence for the impact was not recognized all at once. For years, geologists working in the mountain ranges of southern Nevada, the Pahranagat Range, the Timpahute Range, and surrounding areas, had noted strange rock formations that did not fit the expected geological sequence. There were enormous deposits of what geologists call breccia, rock made up of angular, broken fragments cemented together in a chaotic, jumbled mass. Breccia can form in many ways: landslides, fault zones, volcanic eruptions. But the Alamo breccia was different. The fragments were enormous, some blocks the size of houses, violently displaced from their original positions and mixed with fine-grained matrix material. The deposits were extraordinarily thick. The U.S. Geological Survey has described sections of the Alamo breccia reaching thicknesses of up to roughly 100 meters. 100 meters of shattered, chaotically rearranged rock, deposited in what appeared to be a single catastrophic event. That alone was strange enough, but the details pointed to something far more dramatic than a landslide or a fault collapse. Within the breccia, researchers found shocked quartz, grains of quartz displaying distinctive microscopic deformation patterns that are produced only by the extreme pressures generated by hypervelocity impacts. Shocked quartz does not form in earthquakes. It does not form in volcanic eruptions. It forms when something hits the ground at speeds measured in tens of kilometers per second, the kind of speeds that only extraterrestrial objects achieve. There were other signs. The breccia contained evidence of extreme, sudden disruption of the seafloor, material torn from depth and flung outward, fine-grained ejecta mixed with enormous blocks, graded beds consistent with massive wave action. The geological signature pointed to an impact into shallow marine water, producing not only a crater, but catastrophic tsunamis, enormous waves radiating outward from the impact site and slamming into the surrounding shallow seafloor with enough force to tear up bedrock and redeposit it in thick, chaotic sheets. Reconstructing the Alamo impact is like reading a crime scene written in stone. The crater itself has never been found, at least not with certainty. Hundreds of millions of years of tectonic activity, faulting, uplift, and erosion have dramatically rearranged the original landscape. The rocks that preserve the impact evidence have been folded, faulted, and pushed into mountain ranges that did not exist when the impact occurred. Finding the original crater in this geological mess is like trying to locate the point where a stone was dropped into a pond after the pond has been drained, plowed, and rebuilt as a parking lot. What geologists can say is that the impacting body was probably several hundred meters to perhaps a kilometer or more in diameter. The breccia deposits are spread across an area of more than 10,000 square kilometers, suggesting an event of genuinely catastrophic proportions. Some estimates have compared the energy release to the Chicxulub impact that ended the age of dinosaurs, though the Alamo event was almost certainly smaller. Still, for anything living in that shallow sea, the result would have been annihilating: a wall of water, a rain of debris, the complete destruction of the marine ecosystem across a vast area. What makes the Alamo impact event scientifically valuable, beyond the sheer spectacle of the story, is the quality of the preserved evidence. Because the impact occurred in a marine environment, and because the resulting deposits were subsequently buried, lithified, and then uplifted and exposed by millions of years of mountain building, the Alamo breccia is now one of the best exposed, most accessible examples of impact-related marine breccia anywhere on Earth. Geologists studying impact processes, how craters form in shallow water, how tsunamis redistribute sediment, how marine ecosystems respond to sudden catastrophic disruption, can walk up to outcrops in the Nevada mountains and examine evidence of these processes in extraordinary detail. The central image is worth pausing on. The modern Nevada desert, dry, silent, covered in sagebrush and alkali dust, contains, locked in its mountain rocks, the frozen aftermath of a cosmic collision that occurred when the same ground was a tropical seafloor. The landscape you see from a highway in central Nevada is a palimpsest, layers of history written on top of each other, each one seemingly impossible if you only know the layer above. A man wrapped in a woven mat, dead for nearly 11,000 years, preserved by dry air in a desert cave. Geometric carvings on limestone boulders beside a vanished lake, possibly older than any other rock art on the continent. A cave full of deliberately hidden supplies, part of a logistics network built by people we once dismissed as simple wanderers. A hunting trap stretching for more than 2 kilometers across the desert floor, designed by communities capable of coordinating hundreds of people. A settlement complex swallowed by a modern reservoir, now slowly resurfacing as that reservoir drains. A rock shelter recording 13,000 years of arrivals and departures, of drought and recovery, of persistence in the face of a landscape that never made anything easy. And beneath all of it, beneath the archaeology, beneath the human stories, beneath the millennia of migration and adaptation, the rocks themselves carry the scar of something older still. The day, 382 million years ago, when the sky above a warm sea turned white, and the world in that place ended. Nevada is not empty. It has never been empty. The desert just does a very good job of keeping its secrets. Until someone finally looks.